I'm here in Japan for the next 2 weeks and I'm going to be testing out the Canon R8, which I'm filming on right now. Let's jump in. Canon R8 really is a beast for both photo and video for such a small full frame camera. A great size and really well priced, probably making it the very best value camera in Canon's lineup. So what's the catch? There must be some, right? Well, obviously compared to much more expensive full frame cameras out there, the R8 is missing a few features, but maybe less than you'd think. So in this video, I'm going to look at all the great features of the R8, plus a few that it is missing, if that's going to be a deal breaker for you, and also a few ways we can overcome some of those things that it is missing. Let's jump in. So as mentioned, I was using this camera running around Japan. All the footage and photos you will see in this video were taken on the R8, unless you can see the R8 in frame, which means it was probably shot on my R5. So on paper, the R8 is jammed full of great specs, sharing a lot of features with the much more expensive R6 Mark II body, even sharing some with the much more expensive R3 body. If you are familiar with the old RP, this is basically the new version of that. So it's Canon's lighter, more compact and slightly cheaper full frame camera. Compared to the RP though, we have some really impressive updates. So this is currently priced at around $1,300 US, and here in Australia, that will be just over $2,000. You can also get it with this nifty little and lightweight kit lens, which is a nice focal range from 24 to 50 at f4.5 to 6.3. I did find it quite useful, and here are some photo and video examples shot with this lens. It is also one of the smallest and lightest full frame cameras you can get, making it really great for travel or anyone wanting a lighter setup. Weighing in at only 461 grams, that's 200 grams lighter than the R6 Mark II and almost 300 grams lighter than the R5. Even coming in 22 grams lighter than the Sony EVE1, even though it does still have a viewfinder. In terms of the rest of the design, it does feel much more compact in hand, but to me, it still feels comfortable. You do really notice the difference in the weight and the size, especially when you're like clipping it onto things like your capture clip, you don't notice it as much. And then going back to my R5 after using this camera, it did really feel like a brick. We still have a dedicated photo to video switch in a similar design to the R6 Mark II. And importantly for me, you also have custom modes which you can save for both photo and video. For me, this is really essential for run and gun shooting, switching between photo and video. You won't find an LCD screen at the top of the camera, but to me, this is expected at this price point. The LCD screen on the back is the same resolution as the R6 Mark II. The viewfinder is slightly less, but not something I noticed any issues with. In terms of memory cards, we do only get one SD slot, but as this camera isn't really aimed at higher end professionals, probably no surprises there. Moving on to the sensor and resolution, it basically shares the same sensor as the R6 Mark II, so 24 megapixels, I've said it before, is a really nice sweet spot. More than enough detail for pretty much most things, but your file sizes aren't going to be too large. Because of this, as expected, the image quality is really great. Comparing it to my R5, which obviously has a much larger resolution, there was really no reason for me to pick up the R5 for image quality, unless of course you're wanting to print something extra large. So another big tick for image quality. In terms of the AF speed and performance, you're getting pretty crazy specs in this camera. It is extremely fast and accurate. I noticed this when testing the R6 Mark II, that it felt even better than the R5. And again, this basically feels the same. You really cannot fault it. And again, sharing this system basically the same as the R3, which is an extremely expensive camera. To get this in a much cheaper body like the R8 is a really nice inclusion. The ISO and low light performance in this thing is really impressive as well, as expected, basically sharing that same sensor with the R6 Mark II. Meaning you'll get even slightly better low light performance than the much more expensive R5, which for me I've used for many years and never had any problems in low light. It also offers burst shooting up to 40 frames per second, a nice inclusion for a slightly more budget friendly camera. So you're never going to miss a moment. If turned on, you can also have this pretty crazy pre-shooting option available in raw burst mode, capable of capturing frames before you even press the shutter button. I was actually quite careful with this camera when traveling. I didn't think it had any any degree of weather sealing, but it does actually have some weather resistance. It's hard to know what this means, but definitely less protection than the R5 and potentially the R6 Mark II, but enough to protect you in light rain, drizzle, a little bit of snow. I just wouldn't take it out in particularly crazy conditions where I know my R5 would probably be just fine. So at this price point, again, hard to denote any points there. Moving on to video now, and here are a number of examples shot on the R8. I still found this camera great for video, even despite its lack of IBIS, which on paper might be a deal breaker for some people when it comes to video, but it really doesn't have to be, especially when you want a gimbal for those more specific shots. So all these examples were shot handheld on the R8, and yes, although I was really mindful to be nice and steady without IBIS, you can get some really amazing shots without it. The oversampled 4K video really is great quality, offering this stunning 4K footage up to 60 frames per second and still offering full HD up to 180 frames per second. Again, sharing these same specs with the much more expensive R6 body, you're also getting C-Log still included, so you're getting really great video specs for a slightly more budget-friendly camera. One thing to note here, it doesn't include any raw video features. However, at this price point, I don't think anyone is expecting it to, and it's something I personally don't use anyway. Now, in terms of overheating, I haven't got this thing anywhere close to overheating. I haven't got any of the warnings on screen, despite shooting a lot at 60 frames per second. Now, you will notice when you switch it over to 60 frames per second that it will display a warning that these video settings may overheat the camera. So you'll definitely overheat it eventually if you shoot enough at 60 frames per second. I haven't actually tested how much you'll need to shoot to get there, but I was shooting quite a bit out and about, a lot of photo and video, a lot of video at 60 frames per second. And as I said, I didn't even get it close. So for most people, this definitely isn't going to be an issue. All right, so far I've been super positive with good reason, I think, but obviously this camera does have a few things missing. I think we need to consider its intended market when looking at this. And of course, the first one is the fact that it's missing IBIS. Of course, having IBIS in this camera would have been great. However, if it was included, it would almost be on par with the much more expensive R6 Mark II body. So naturally, I can kind of see why that was chosen to be left out. Also, the fact that this body is really small and lightweight. Just from the mechanics, if you were to add IBIS into it, I imagine it would increase the weight and the size a little bit, kind of defeating one of the biggest positives for this camera, which is its size and weight. When shooting stills, I was still able to drop my shutter speed a little bit and shoot handheld, but you may notice it on video. Again, I was still super happy with the video footage I could get from this camera. Of course, a gimbal will overcome this issue instantly, and for a lot of people, when you need those really steady shots, you're probably going to opt for a gimbal anyway. So depending on your needs, this may not be a deal breaker. That brings me to the next obvious downsides, which of course is the battery. Now again, in quite a small and lightweight full frame camera, the battery is a bit of a compromise. So it is a smaller, lighter battery than both the R6, R5 bodies. And yes, you will notice that you go through it really quickly. Now there is a few ways you can overcome this, of course. You can purchase a few extra batteries, and if you're worried about price, some of the third-party batteries still last quite well. You can pick them up quite cheap on Amazon. Another thing you can do, which I was actually doing because I only had one battery with me, was actually charging this with a battery pack because it does have USB-C charging. Because the battery is not super large, it charges reasonably quick. So I plugged it in when I was out at lunch or taking a break from shooting, and it charged up pretty quickly. So obviously carrying a battery pack will increase the weight in your bag, which may defeat the purpose of having a smaller, lighter full frame camera. But a lot of people are carrying one anyway. So again, this mightn't be a deal breaker. And if you purchase a few extra batteries, you're still getting that really light, compact setup in your hands. The only other major downside compared to something like the R6 Mark II is the fact you're only getting one SD slot. Again, this camera probably isn't aimed more at professionals, and you can overcome this a little bit if you're worried about it. Now, personally, I never back up to 2 cards at once. I'm really good at backing up my footage quickly afterwards. I'm mindful to use good SD cards, and I'm mindful to swap out my SD cards after I've been using them for quite some time. So doing these things, you're probably far better off and going to have less issues anyway. But of course, this depends on what you're shooting. I know for weddings, a lot of people shoot 2 cards at once, but to me, this probably isn't aimed at those higher end professionals. You're probably going to purchase a much more expensive camera for those type of things anyway. So these are my final thoughts. As you can see, I really enjoyed using this camera, and in conclusion, I want one. So I was only using this camera on loan. I have to give it back now, which is kind of sad because I've really liked using it as a second camera to my R5. It really suits my needs, having that lighter body. So I may consider picking one up as my second camera in the future. If you're using this as your main body, to me, the only slight downside that can't really be overcome if you're shooting handheld is just the IBIS. Now, it's not a deal breaker for me, especially as a second camera, but potentially as my main camera, I would want that IBIS. So if IBIS is really important to you, perhaps consider the R6 Mark II, but again, it is quite more expensive. So I think this is probably the best value, definitely the best value full frame camera in Canon's lineup, and definitely going to be a great camera for so many people out there, definitely worth considering. Thanks so much for watching. Please let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Please do subscribe, keep on creating and keep on growing, my friends. I will catch you in the next one. Bye for now.
Back and glitch.